Anybody who's been around the musical world for more than a handful of years has heard some musical conventional wisdom. You're playing too much. You gotta just groove. It's an age-old tradition in rehearsals, sessions, in class, and on gigs. You're playing too loud. You gotta support the singer during the verse. It's a way more experienced musicians pass on their wisdom to us youngsters. Dude, you're old. Am I old? Okay, us oldsters. Anyway, in my experience, it's one of the best ways to learn. You gotta listen to the bass player and lock up. And especially from good musicians, the advice is usually true. Get your head out of the music, relax, and listen. But some conventional wisdom around the drums is wrong. And recently, a lot of that wrong advice has been popping up in my comments. You gotta just feel it. You're either born with it or you're not. You can't practice feel. Jazz isn't hard. You can't be a serious player unless you have a lot of gigs. If you're practicing, that means you're overthinking. There's no difference between good drummers and bad ones. The worst part is, a lot of this bad advice directly influences young drummers, who are still deciding how much time or effort to devote to the drums, or whether they're going to be any good. So today, I'm going to dismantle the top 5 myths that hold drummers back. And if you stick around, it's all leading up to the #1 most pervasive drum myth out there. The one I see creeping back in my comment threads. The one that's hurting drummers the most, and the one I'd most like to see dispensed with. First though, channel theme. Myth 5. Choppers can't play groove. If you've played drums for more than a day, you've probably heard this one. I'd always get an earful whenever I did a video about trying to learn a solo, fill, or even a style. Choppers are ruining the drums. They play too much. They can't groove. A lot of the criticism was aimed at a particular style of chops, which I'll call church chops for copyright reasons. Then there was an Instagram influencer who announced to the world that Insta choppers can't groove. Let me first give credit to the spirit of this campaign and tell you what I agree with. If you only watch Insta choppers chop, you're getting a distorted impression of what real drumming is. You're seeing like 2% of the gig blown up as if it's 100%. And if you try to play church chops on everything and turn everything into a trap beat, that's not going to be appropriate for a lot of musical situations. But the idea that choppers can't groove? Like, just a few examples.
Feel that? Woo!
First of all, that church tradition lives and dies by groove. Like, you think if you can't hold a band together, people in church are gonna be okay if you just chop? But it's also silly. If you have the ability to chop for real, and that means cleanly and in time, you don't think those fine powers of perception are also gonna redound to some better groove? I'm calling this one debunked. Myth 4. Playing with better musicians is the best way to improve your feel. A few weeks back, I did a video on what to practice to improve your feel right away, instead of grinding away for years. I argued that a big part of being able to groove, play pocket, and improve your feel was a matter of correcting your perception. A big part of which you could do very quickly by addressing some very common optical illusions. For instance, the almost universal tendency to rush off beats at the end of a bar, and drag down beats, especially going from the end of one bar to the beginning of the next. By focusing on hearing those tendencies accurately, I argued, you could improve your feel a bunch. Most comments were positive, but there was a chorus of, "You're wrong, bro. The only way to improve your feel is by playing with better musicians." I used to hear this one a lot in music school. And let me be clear, playing with better musicians is a great way to improve your playing overall, and a crucial part, maybe the most crucial part, of becoming a great musician yourself. But that's not the only way to improve your feel, for two primary reasons. First, if you haven't done the work to hear yourself more accurately, a better player is not going to be able to show you all the areas where you're rushing or dragging on musically. Sure, if he or she is stubborn and insists on playing the beat where it actually is and making the whole gig a slug, you may see some of the areas where you're clashing with them. But it's a way slower and more frustrating way to learn than just using the metronome cleverly in the practice room, and then trying it on the gig, and probably getting nods of approval from those better musicians. The second reason playing with better musicians isn't the be-all end-all is that many times they're compensating for your deficiencies and covering them up. This happened a number of times when I was learning. I'd do a lesson with Jay Anderson and we'd sound great together because Jay was moving his beat just slightly to find me, even if I wasn't super solid. Ditto my buddy Dark Anderson, a New Orleans veteran who cut a record with Blade and a monster of the stand-up bass. He played with such a big, assertive beat that his beat was always easy to find, and when I'd rush or drag, he'd also adjust to me. It wasn't until later, listening to recordings of myself, that I realized how fully these guys had been carrying me. So, absolutely play with better musicians. But it's not a substitute for hard work with the metronome. Myth 3. You shouldn't count, you should just feel it. Whenever I do a video about odd meters, I always get this comment. Bro, I don't count meters, I just feel stuff. You're still counting? Counting is over. Like some of the other myths, this one's seductive because it's partly true in most contexts, and totally true in a few contexts. Like, take this tune from Josh Redman's Elastic album. Do you need to know it's in 7, or should you just be feeling bum bum ba-dum, bum ba-dum, bum ba-dum, bum? How about this ditty from Gilad Hexelman? Do you need to know it's in 9? Or would you rather just feel bum 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 bum? The problem comes when you're not just flying straight and level. Like whenever there's a figure, composed or improvised, that cuts against the primary meter. Like this bit in this just in. Or this from the song John's Blues on Vinny's solo album. When there are rhythmic optical illusions that might pull your ear away from the real one, you need that counting. Here's an example in 4. This is Stablemates from Walter Smith with Marcus Gilmore on drums. The whole problem with just feeling things is the whole band needs to arrive at the one together at some point, and if somebody's lost, people are going to know it. One spot I always make sure to count carefully is going into the bridge on 7 ways. The next situation in which you'd really want to count is one in which the composer breaks the pattern to create surprise. 2 great examples of this are my friend Mike Webster's tunes, Indecision and Momentous. Both switch between meters in a way that breaks the pattern. In Indecision, the switches between 5 and 6 are supposed to surprise the listener. So if you're just feeling it, you're going to miss them, unless you know the tune really well.
The repeat's good on the first page. Cool. But not on the second. CPM.
I'd heard it a bunch of times before I played it with Mike on a gig, but I still had to count like crazy when we actually played it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Finally, learning to count in your head as you play will help you internalize things better so you can start to feel them. But implying you should skip straight to the feel is like saying, don't practice boxing, just fight MMA fighters, you'll feel it. Myth 2. Music school will make you great. When I watched Whiplash, my biggest quibble wasn't with the rehearsal antics, which, as I said in my Jazz Vibe video, I've seen real-life examples of, nor with the music, although it was a little unrealistic for a real high-level college. It was with the central conceit of the plot.
I want to be great.
Andrew Neiman knows if he can just survive Fletcher, he'll become one of the greats. And he'll get gigs.
Everybody remember, Lincoln Center and its ilk use these competitions to decide who they're interested in and who they're not.
More on the reality of that situation in a minute, but let's just say everybody in my peer group knew it was BS, and I assumed every other musician would as well. Then I came across a video called Confessions of an Ex-Berkeley Student. I won't spend much time on it, but the guy was scandalized because a teacher told him to play more eighth notes in an audition. And because upon returning home after graduation, he tried to play a Beatles tune and couldn't play it to his satisfaction. Forgive me if I'm talking out of turn or misinterpreting, but the assumption of that video, as I read it, was the same as that in Whiplash. Music school has the responsibility to make you good. Like you're some kind of ex machina robot and they're the programmer. So let me say for the record from experience, it does not work that way. Music school gives you very good lessons, access to top tier teachers, access to a network of peers, and a kind of pressure cooker of accelerated learning. All of which will doubtless help you get there. But nobody's gonna make you a great musician but you. Here's what would have happened to the real-life Andrew Neiman. He would have endured all that drama at school, then graduated, and realized he might as well have transferred, because he's still playing restaurant gigs with peers, and hitting sessions every night, and practicing 4 hours a day, and gradually increasing his skill level, and crawling his way onto the scene over the course of like 10 years of additional work. But that wouldn't have made a very dramatic movie. Likewise, the Berkeley guy, in my humble opinion, needs to recognize that Berkeley gave him a lot of tools, but he's ultimately in charge of his own success. If he wants to learn to play Hey Jude, or play more melodically, or play fewer eighth notes, just learn that stuff. Tony Ferguson doesn't show up for practice and just trust that his coach will make him beat all of his opponents. He trains like crazy and watches a ton of tape. He views his coaches as facilitating his construction of himself as a better fighter, not the other way around. And before we get to the number one myth, a quick message from our sponsor. Just kidding, we don't have any sponsors. Let's get to myth 1. Myth 1. Anybody can tell the difference between a mediocre drummer and a good one. Of all the videos I've released in the past year, by far the one that's gotten the most negative feedback is 5 subtle ways pros can tell a mediocre drummer from a good one. There was a lot of random hate, which happens when you imply there's a hierarchy somewhere, and I won't waste your time with that. But there was one specific comment of a type I've been fighting since the beginning of this channel. Bro, there's nothing subtle about being a good drummer. If somebody's any good, he'll sound good to a novice. Also, stop criticizing Dylan, Elise, Arik and Prada, and Moon Hooch. Here's one of the actual comments. Here's what I think they're saying. If one drummer is better than another in any way, then a pure novice, someone who's never played at all, can tell immediately and in any context. Except that's not my real life experience. In real life, I'd listen to recordings of Ed Thigpen playing brushes, then play along in the practice room and think, I'm getting this. Then I'd sit down at a real jam session and realize there was a huge gulf between what I thought was good in the practice room and what was actually adequate to play with a real band. Better still, after playing myself, sometimes I'd get to observe an actual master close up. In that one teachable moment, I'd become aware there was a whole world of subtleties that made them better than I was. I just couldn't see it until somebody held up the right lens. The analogy is MMA. Casual fans might wonder why a fighter doesn't do anything if he's being held up against the cage, or why somebody doesn't just get up from guard, or why it looks like nobody's making any progress here. If you've never climbed in a ring or walked out on a jiu-jitsu mat, maybe you think fights should look like this. Or this. But unless you've felt a live sparring match, you're not sure what's going on here.
Выйти из этой позиции, а не просто сидеть и ждать, пока тебе там ногу покрутят во всю сторону.
Another analogy. We can watch baseball and wonder why the guys aren't hitting home runs on every pitch. Then you face down an actual pitcher and hear the hiss coming off the seams of the ball as it careens toward you, and the sonic boom it makes when it contacts the catcher's mitt. And then you realize, oh, this isn't so easy. So you get my point, right? There are subtleties that require pointing out, and the right context to see, at least for the first time. Here's the single drum example I'll show. Think a drum beat is a drum beat is a drum beat. That'd be your rationale if you criticized me for saying early Dylan was decent, but not in a world where we have Vinnie Colaiuta and Ron Bruner, the best drummer in the world. Anyway, example time. Here's Flea playing with Chad Smith. And here's Flea jamming with someone who's playing the same drum beat as Chad on paper. Feel, touch, dynamics, lockup, letting the music breathe. All those subtleties. So, if there are some viewers for whom I've helped lift the veil, and maybe, just maybe, you can start to see that there's some there. Just imagine you had 20 years of looking at distinctions like these. Pros can absolutely see subtleties that are mostly opaque to the rest of us. Any additional myths I left out? Leave them in the comments. And if you've been a fan of the channel for a minute and want to support what I'm doing, I've got a brand new way for you to do that. Just click below to check out my Patreon page. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. To the script, Batman. Hey.